In the Gospel of Luke chapter 14, verses 25 to 33, Jesus gives us two very interesting examples that speaks of calculating the cost. Just prior to that, Jesus extended the invitation to everyone to follow him. To follow him not just as followers, but as disciples. So in order for all of us to follow, we must be willing to take up our cross. That's the challenge Jesus has for us. He says, if you wish to follow me, you must take up your cross. Now, the difference between being a follower and a disciple is pretty clear, right? Anyone can follow, but to become a disciple, you have to be willing to change your life each day to become more like Christ. Now, let's take a look at these two examples that are found in the Gospel of Luke chapter 14, verses 25 to 33. They both have to, they both talk about the cost, right, of discipleship. And this is really interesting because as we take a look at these two examples, I want to share 3 points about these two examples. But let's just take a look at these two examples first. Example 1, it's about constructing the tower, right, and counting the cost. Here's what Jesus says. Which one of you, after constructing a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if there's enough for completion? Otherwise, after laying the foundation and finding himself unable to finish the work, the onlookers should laugh at him and say, this one began to build but did not have the resources to finish. Now, think about this for a moment. When it comes to construction, right, we always want to sit down and plan out everything before we begin. Why? Because the idea is to make sure you have enough of material, you have enough of the financing, you have enough of everything in order to complete this work. Now, you probably know yourself of projects that have started but never finished, right? There are different reasons for that, but it can be lack of fund, lack of finances, feasibility, etc., whatever the case may be, right? But if you start something and you don't ever finish, you can see this is very problematic, right? And so the important thing here is to calculate the cost and to ask, can I actually finish this project, right? That's example number 1. Let's take a look at example number 2. This is more interesting. A king going into battle with his enemy and calculating the cost. Now Jesus says, or what king marching into battle would not first sit down and decide whether with 10,000 troops he can successfully oppose another king advancing upon him with 20,000 troops. But if not, while he's still far away, he will send a delegation to ask for peace terms. Now, this is another example of calculating the costs. So imagine going into battle, right? You want to make sure you can win, right? But if you can't win, well, what do? You settle, right? You go, you send peace terms, a delegation, etc. So both of these 2 examples, which we just talked about, has to do with calculating the cost. Is it worth it, right? And so here I'd like to share 3 points for us to reflect on. Point number 1 is to calculate the cost based on our own life. Through the 2 short parables, which we just heard here, the one about the builder, constructing a tower, and the one about the king strategizing whether or not to go to war, the point here is to calculate the cost and to really ask, is it worth it? And in the same way, we ask the question, is it worth it to follow Jesus? The reality here is all of us want to follow Jesus. And we want to journey with Jesus, but the question is the cost worth it? Right? Are we making that effort? Or do we simply only say it in words but not in action, right? When we speak of discipleship, it has to be demonstrated in action as well, not just in words. So some of us are pretty good at making excuses, right? We say something like, well, I'll follow Jesus, when I grow older, right? Or when I graduate from college, or when I get my first job, or when I retire, or when this or that, right? And we keep pushing it off as well, too. We make various different excuses. But Jesus makes it very clear in this gospel passage here, right? Calculate the cost and see if it's worth following me, right? Because Jesus promises us heaven, right? Heaven if we follow him. But in order for us to follow him, it's not all that easy, right? There are challenges. We must carry our crosses. Now, point number two I'd like to share here is all of us have a choice to make, right? We have this free choice to follow Jesus or to follow something else. You see, God gives us the freedom to choose. We have a choice to make, to serve God or to serve something else, right? And we always have to calculate the cost in our own lives and ask the question, is it worth it? Now, in our world today, there are many temptations out there telling us, well, this is worth it, this is worth it, this is more worth it, right? But we have to really pause and reflect, what is truly the treasure that is worth it, that endures forever? And what we see here is that Jesus is giving us this treasure. It is heaven. But in order for us to get there, we must be willing to follow Jesus. We must be willing to follow Jesus. And so then this leads us to point number 3 I'd like to share. Point number 3, following Jesus entails complete faith and trust in him. Now, what does it take to follow Jesus? What does it take for you personally? It takes a lot of trust and a lot of faith. And if you ever see an image of the divine mercy of God, under it says, Jesus, I trust in you. And it's so clear because in order for us to follow Jesus, we must have faith and completely trust in him. Now, there are times in our lives when we have doubts, right? When we struggle. There are times in our lives when we don't understand or we feel, very empty or hopeless. There are times in our lives when we feel as if we're going in the wrong direction. But faith is about believing without seeing everything. It's about believing without completely understanding. And in our own journey of faith, sometimes things are not always clear. But one thing is clear, Jesus is always there for us, and he always leads us into the right path, the right direction. And so you see, there is this cost to discipleship, and the cost entails that we fully commit ourselves to him. It entails that we follow Jesus and his teachings. The center of all of this is faith and trust in him, right? So Jesus gives us this invitation too. Come, follow me, follow Jesus, right? But the question is, after we think about it, calculated cost, is it worth it for us? And if the answer is yes, then Jesus invites us not to become just followers, but to become his disciples. The question is, will you follow Jesus Christ? May God bless you.